No, it's still
Ah. Yeah.
That's the one.
Yeah. I'm sorry? Okay. Good afternoon, my name is Sam Scheiner. This is work done along with Mike Barfield and Paul, University of Florida. I'm at National Science Foundation. And I'm going to talk today about modes of adaptation. For those of you who've been sitting through this morning and this afternoon, the focus has been primarily on phenotypic plasticity as a mode of adaptation. We heard a little bit about bed hedging as an alternative. And I'm going to talk about yet another alternative, which is habitat construction. So imagine that you exist in a...
Yeah, hit down.
Hit down. Got it. So you organism lives in a variable environment. There are two ways, well, two among a number of ways that you might adapt to that environment. One is by, so your phenotype does not match the environment. Well, let's just change the environment. That's habitat construction as contrasted with what we've been hearing about, which is your phenotype does not match the environment, so you change your phenotype. So you can change your environment or you can change your phenotype, but to make one match the other. And the question that I'm going to address today is, if both modes are potential evolutionary responses, how are those, how might they interact with each other during evolution? In other words, will one mode win out over the other if both are possible? So unlike the other talks you've been hearing, this is strictly a modeling talk. No actual organisms were harmed in doing this work. But I'm going to motivate this, though, by giving you a scenario of a situation where both modes might be operating. So we have a plant growing in the ground, and a key nutrient for plants is nitrogen. Plants take out nitrogen from the soil, from their roots, that gets incorporated into the plant, but how much nitrogen you want to take up, how much effort you put into roots, depends on how much nitrogen there is relative to other things. For example, what's the optimal amount of photosynthesis? So plants are plastic in their root-to-shoot ratio in terms of how much they're going to try to incorporate nitrogen. But there's another way in which plants, at least some species, can get nitrogen. And I should mention then that the plant feeds that nitrogen back into the soil as either leaves drop, the plant dies, whatever. So that nitrogen recycles. But there is this other mode, that is, some plants have symbiotic bacteria, rhizobia, that are associated with their roots. And those rhizobia can directly take up atmospheric nitrogen, which plants can't. And then the nitrogen from the rhizobia gets into the plant. And so in this case, and then finally, nitrogen gets lost from the system, either going back into the atmosphere or leaching into groundwater. So in this case, there's a construction trait in the sense that the plant can provide support for those rhizobia or not, and plants have the ability to vary in the amount of support, and so that actually can add nitrogen to the entire system by increasing the amount that's coming in from the atmosphere. So this is one possible scenario in which both construction and plasticity could be evolving. So that's just an example. The actual model is not of this in particular, but a more abstract version of this. So now let me talk about the model. We'll start in the first set of scenarios. There's spatial variation, and I'll get to that in a moment. So the environment is determined by the combination, some baseline condition. there's construction, imagine you're increasing the amount of nitrogen in the soil, and then there's decay, the nitrogen that's in the soil is getting lost to the atmosphere or the groundwater. The decay happens as simply a fixed proportional decrease back to whatever the baseline is, so let's say 40% decrease every generation, and then construction is genetically determined. So a given individual, based on their genotype, has a certain propensity to do this construction, to increase the amount of nitrogen, and it's a logistic function. So there's some maximum amount that an individual can do, and then for the population as a whole, it's the sum of what all of the individuals are doing. The phenotype of an individual is based on two types of loci. A non-plastic set, that is, their expression is not a function of the environment, and then a plastic set of loci whose expression is based on the environment. And this then allows the system to evolve either to a plastic, have a plastic response or a non-plastic response to the environment. And then finally, as I say, there's spatial variation here. We have a gradient, deans going from 1 to 50 habitats, and the optimum is changing along that habitat. And so we've got this baseline, and then this optimum that construction is trying to reach, or you're trying to match genetically or through plasticity. So that's the basics. Just a couple, the life history in this case is individuals are born, and at the same time birth happens, the decay process occurs. There's development, dispersal, viability, selection, and then random mating. Everybody dies, and new birth, so separate generations. Plasticity, of course, happens at the development stage relative to whatever the environment is, and construction can occur at one of three time points. So for any given parameter set, there's only one. Construction happens once, but we're going to look at what happens when construction happens before development, or after development, or after dispersal, because depending upon when construction happens, either the construction can then affect the development of the organism, or if it's before or after dispersal, it means that when you're doing your construction, you yourself or your offspring may or may not benefit from that construction. So for simulations in which there's only construction, we'll contrast 1 and 3, because 2 is, if there's no plasticity, there's no development. So 1 and 2 are identical to each other. Or when we have construction plus plasticity, we'll have those 3. So there's 5 possible scenarios here that we're looking at. Just a couple of other details for those who are curious. It's soft selection. For all 3 sets of loci, there are 5 diploid unlinked loci, so it's effectively a continuous trait, 100 individuals, random mating, and other details. We go for 1,000 generations to reach a quasi-equilibrium, 20 replicates, and you'll see the results of those 20 replicates. So, first, let's look at the evolution of that construction trait. So, in these graphs, on this axis is the rate of dispersal, right? So that affects whether or not you and or your offspring are going to remain in the environment in which you have done construction. So that's along here, and then relative construction means that if at a value of 1, it means that the population is reaching that optimum in terms of the amount of construction that's going on. And so we're contrasting where construction alone is happening versus with plasticity. And you see there's sort of a small effect that is at low dispersal rates when there is plasticity, the amount of construction is a little bit less. Up here it's pretty much the same. So in general, that is, construction decreases slightly if it happens before development happens in these organisms, with a little bit of effect of plasticity. So now let's look what's happening to plasticity. So the same sort of thing, except that now the axis here, relative plasticity, means that A value of 1 means that the population has evolved to be a pure plasticity response, and a value of 0 means there's pure genetic differentiation, there's no plasticity. As you can see in this case, we reach an intermediate, so there's partial plasticity, partial genetic differentiation. At high dispersal rates, pretty much no differences. At low dispersal rates, though, notice that in the cases of plasticity here that are happening after development, there's slightly more plasticity than in the case of either plasticity alone or construction 3. So again, at low dispersal rates, there is this effect where plasticity increases if construction does happen in the same dean as that the plasticity is occurring, right? So at those lower dispersal rates. So i.e., if the construction is adding some kind of a reliable, is happening in a way that creates a reliable signal for plasticity, then plasticity will evolve. So that's kind of nice. So let's now contrast that with temporal variability. So in this case now, there's just a single dean. So there's no longer spatial gradient, there's a single dean, and in that single dean, there's random variation in the environment that occurs also at the same time construction happens. So depending upon when that is, and then the construction can happen either before or after development. So here's the life history, construction before or after development with plasticity, and let's see what happens. So with construction, there's absolutely no effect of plasticity on construction evolution. In contrast, when we look at plasticity, not too surprising, if variation happens after development, there's no reliable signal, so you don't evolve plasticity. Construction appears to affect plasticity evolution, right? You get this intermediate. Notice both the before and after, but this is a little bit of an illusion. Because remember, with construction, there's two parts to that. There's the construction and there's the decay. Here's what happens with the decay. Notice that looks just like what with construction. What's actually happening is that the decay, so otherwise the temporal variation is white noise. And in this case, what's happening is that decay process actually adds an autocorrelation to the temporal variation. And so that autocorrelation actually then creates a predictability that allows you to select for plasticity, and it's exactly the amount you would predict based on that autocorrelation. So in conclusion, with spatial variation, the evolution of habitat construction is slightly decreased by the potential for phenotypic plasticity. Construction enhances selection for plasticity if that construction happens before development at low dispersal rates. But with temporal variation, the two modes of adaptation, habitat construction and phenotypic plasticity, are pretty much independent of each other. So, to return to that initial question, which mode dominates if both are possible? The answer is that the two pretty much evolve nearly independently. And I think